Janet talked about Earth Day, and that reminds me because I was a 25-year-old in 1970 working on a plasma physics doctoral thesis, thinking that events that lasted a few microseconds that were supposed to produce limitless electricity, which every 10 years they announced would produce it 10 years further into the future, made me a little bit, leery. And then Earth Day comes along and they said, but dust and smoke can reflect sunlight and cool the planet, and greenhouse gases like CO2 trap heat in the infrared and can warm the planet. And I kind of didn't believe it. Come on. Pollution, it's the usual stuff. It's air pollution, air as thick as a knife, sends kids to the hospital with asthma, bad for old folks with emphysema, or others with lung sensitivity, green slime and bad water, but climate? So I took the one class that existed at Columbia at the time, and yeah, lo and behold, that was true. It took us about 4 years to sort out whether warming was more likely than cooling. And I still have to deal with the likes of those fine scientists, that famous climate scientist, George Will, telling me that I'm an environmentalist for all temperatures because I thought cooling might be true in 1971. That's true, we did before we had the data. And then, like scientists are supposed to do, you get data which shows A, you thought dust was global and CO2 was global, and we find out dust is 20% of the planet, heavy dust, and B, that it isn't just CO2, but there are 3 or 4 other greenhouse gases, so then, of course, the evidence drives you in a direction. And you go with the direction and you change your positions based upon evidence. Well, now we all know how well the political system, the legal system is at doing that, and sometimes the media. So scientists do occasionally feel pretty lonely when they do exactly what they're toilet trained to do, follow the evidence, change their mind, and be proud of it, and then you're being derided for being politically inconsistent and therefore a joke, because if you thought cooling in 1970 and now you think warming, obviously you don't know anything, unlike those guys who are so deeply educated and knowledgeable in every aspect of complex issues. So, don't worry, it's going to get worse. Wait till we talk about testifying in front of Congress. Okay. Which, by the way, in this year has been dramatically different than any time since the late 1970s in terms of bipartisanship and reasonable cordiality. And there are hearings when the witnesses that were brought in by the then majority were really famous scientists with long publication lists. The 2 most famous professors, Limbaugh and Crichton. And when guys like that are appearing in front of Congress as an expert and getting, quote, equal time, you begin to wonder about the estate of the media. But I can't put the media down too much because Kerry Benefield's article in the Press Democrat probably was responsible. How many of you were here because you saw that? Right. Wow. Kerry, are you here? No, well, you should be proud of that, and so should your editor. But the good news, you couldn't get in, right? The good news, that's right. We don't have any privilege for the press, right? That would be considered, non-independence. But the point that I wanted to make, since I suspected that was the case, is not all publicity is of the right kind. And those other famous professors I mentioned are very good at generating it too. And the media has, talking of toilet training, it has a behavior, and that behavior is balance. So if you get the Republican, what have you got to do? Get the Democrat, otherwise it's unfair. And in political reporting, I think they're right. I think it is inappropriate, except in blogging and in opinion pieces, to do it any other way. But when you start using the political model of reporting to control and describe complex issues like climate, where somebody from a deep ecology group pointing out in the worst case examples the number of species that could go extinct and the sort of end of the world end of the spectrum, and then somebody from, say, an enterprise institute saying how expensive it is to fix it and how many coal miners' daughters would be living in poverty if we had a carbon tax, and how it's all too uncertain anyway, and CO2 is plant food. They like to say, yeah, it's true. It's also food for weeds, and it's also a way to make the oceans acidic. But naturally, they select the parts that fit the storyline or the client interest or the ideology. And then you end up getting the media balance driven by the two positions, end of the world and good for you, which I will confess my prejudice, the two lowest probability outcomes in the climate debate. So when you look at a complex issue, it isn't bipolar. I'm not talking about some of the participants, I'm talking about the debate. So now, you've got instead a bell curve. You've got a wide range of potential outcomes, and what good science is doing when it's doing its job in complex systems world is it's trying to winnow out the stuff that's well established, that's really pretty much beyond doubt, from the stuff that we have competing explanations and some good ideas but not completely solved, from the stuff that's speculative. And the trouble is, in the public and the media debate and in front of Congress, it gets all conflated, and often on purpose. So the average person thinks, wait, the PhDs don't know. If they don't know, how can I know? So why don't we wait and see? And I promise you, there are a lot of people very well paid who want you to wait and see. So what I'm going to do is show you a slide or two or three or four or maybe a few more than that, and we'll have a few fun ringers in there as well, and try to lay out this problem as I think the scientific community in particular, since the UN association, represented by Paul and Gus here, has been involved in sponsoring the IPCC, how those scientists try to convey what they believe to be the combination of urgency and uncertainty in both a politically powerful yet scientifically honest way. This is not a trivial thing to do, and we'll talk about it later on, and it's particularly difficult when you're doing it in the context of a world where you have, very often, a media deliberately searching for that end of the world and good for you phrase that you said so you can get locked into the box of a classical political storyline which fits so badly into complex science. The underlying talk, which I'm not giving, but in a way, what's really critical in what I've said for the last 2 or 3 minutes is it really raises a fundamental question. We're very proud of our democracy, and everybody complains a little bit about when the public isn't quite as literate as we wish they were on complex issues. But climate change, as much as any problem I have ever seen, is a real test of whether democracy can survive complexity. Because if we're going to fall for the quick, glib lines of the fake professors I mentioned before and the phony media balance that's also common, people are either going to be knocked off their pins and run away from a problem as too complex or start believing simple-sounding, polarized views that fit either their ideological preconditions or what Uncle Joe told them when he really doesn't know what he's talking about. Then what happens is you end up having a whole series of voters sending mixed messages to politicians. And when politicians get mixed messages from voters, we all know what happens. They listen to the special interests. So if you want to get rid of special interests, you make them think you care. It's amazing how they do tend to follow that when we're not in some cacophonous divide. And therefore, having organized groups at the grassroots, as I saw many are here. I see Jay Halcombe and Francois Fleury-Halcombe here, and I know you guys organize grassroots, and there are others doing that. That really matters, because one group can't change the world, but one group talking to another, networking can change the community. Then that community talking to other communities can change a county, which can, when talking to others, can change a state. And when the state's California, the world's 7th largest economy and 11th largest greenhouse gas emitter, and it has the best climate policy in the planet, and it has Hollywood and some other fairly sexy characters, in its top echelon, it's unbelievable how that's seen all over the world and how that kind of leadership matters. So never put down the importance of what seems to be a small network, but it has to be more than just your friends and family. You've got to link the networks. But anyhow, I get ahead of myself. Okay, let's move on to the first scientific slide. Why are you laughing? There's a great deal of intellectual content in this slide. Okay, how many lawyers we got in this room? All right, just 1, 2, and they're in the program. Oh, all right, there's 1 or 2 others. Else I could pick on you mercilessly. Yeah. Oh, yeah, but I thought that was a job description. No, we're just kidding, just kidding. All right, so let's take so you guys can't answer the question. The jury's still out. Well, all right, if a jury is out, and it's a criminal trial, what is the standard to which the jury is supposed to be deliberating? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Anybody want to tell me what's the probability of a reasonable doubt? Well, my lawyer friends correct me now, and just because they're law professors doesn't make them any better at this, say, I don't know, 99%, something like that. But of course, nobody's bothered to actually do an analysis and find out whether it really was. And what bothers me is whatever the criteria for some numerical equivalence is, how consistent is that from judge to judge and jury to jury and judge and jury? Oh my God. So what makes me so nervous about it is the inconsistency. I personally was very active through the UN system to get IPCC last time, 6 years ago, to buy into what I wrote with a colleague, Richard Moss, called the Uncertainty Guidance Paper, which insisted that when we used words like likely, low confidence, that it was linked to a scale of subjective probability. You know, if there were 100 worlds like this, and we think it's very likely that it's going to warm up more than 3 degrees, that means in those 100 worlds, with all the uncertainties that we know, our best guess is very likely is 95 out of 100. Likely is 9 out of 10. So that's what we did, and we sort of forced ourselves to at least mean the same darn thing when we use the same words. So immediately, I told you there's a lot of content in that cartoon. So immediately we have to say, what is the odds? Now, supposing the jury's out on a civil case, what's the criteria? Preponderance of evidence. Now, what's the probability of a preponderance? Better than half, I heard somebody say? Yeah. Whoa, you mean 49% chance you're wrong and give them 1 trillion? I mean, you know, scientists have some trouble with that. I don't. I have trouble with not being relatively explicit on A, what your criteria are, and B, how you got to the numbers, and C, how much confidence do you have in the numbers you got to. So right at the outset, I know the artist wasn't quite thinking of what we just spent the last 5 minutes talking about, but what I've talked about in the context of the cartoon is true in not just jury trials, but it's also true in deep, difficult problems like effectiveness of strategic defense or climate change. There is so much uncertainty and so many embedded elements, starting with how many people in the world, ending up with their standards of living and what will happen to the climate if we have X amount of trees cut down. Every single one of those statements differs in its degree of establishment and its degree of uncertainty. So you have to deal with things as if you were dealing in roulette wheels and wheels of fortune, because every element of it has uncertainty. Some uncertainties less than others, and we can't use uncertainty either A as an excuse to do nothing, or B, pretend it doesn't exist because it's inconvenient to what our ideology is. And that's where science often gets into some conflict with some advocacy groups, because we're very anal about insisting that the full range of uncertainties go along. And anyhow, what kind of idiot would take a 5% chance of wrecking the life support system? You'd be amazed. In fact, while we're at that, I'll tell you a story. Well, as long as I brought it up early, I just have a slide, which I do it, but I did it early up. Let me make sure I don't do this again. Okay, I remember being attacked by an economist friend. How many economists we have here? Only 2 or 3. God, why is it that lawyers and economists don't go to my talks? I mean, if you took an average of the population of academics and intellectuals, they are a much larger fraction than to go to these talks. I don't know. Maybe they read the web, or maybe they don't want to know. Now, anyhow, So the key question is, so what's the probability of dangerous climate change? And I'll explain later why we have that phrase. It's a UN phrase, actually. And the US signed the law, which agrees with that phrase as part of the law of the land. But nobody had really clearly defined it. So I was showing a bell curve once, and I talked about how utterly catastrophic outcomes, sort of 5% chance, mild outcomes and beneficial outcomes, 5% chance, and everything else in the middle, you know. And these are subjective probabilities because there's no data on the future, so it's impossible in principle to have, you know, a coin flip on the future until it rolls around, so you have to build models of how it works, and we'll get to that later again, I hope. And I don't tell too many stories. And in any case, so I remember talking about dramatic extinction of species, greater than 50% of known species, and these other kinds of potentially catastrophic outcomes, you know, something on the 5–10% level. So one economist friend in the front row says, "Oh, Steve, you mean to tell us you want to deny the Chinese and Indians a chance to catch up with us when they're a factor of 7 per capita below us in emissions, and therefore in their per capita GDP, and you want people, even in this country, who haven't yet made it, to be denied the opportunity of the rich people who are using an overabundant share of the atmospheric capacity to absorb our tailpipe and smokestack wastes? It's just unethical, and it's only a 5% chance." So I said, "Oh, come on, Joe, supposing we were eating salmon that night, only a 5% chance that there's salmonella in the salmon. You gonna eat it? You know, supposing there's a 5% chance that the rivets are gonna pop off the airplane tomorrow when you fly home, you're gonna get on the plane?" And then I had a better one, you know, because those it's kind of death analogies. I mean, it's not just death. I mean, this is a stress. It could be death for individuals and species, but it's a stress on aggregate. And so I came up with a quiz, this perfect size room for this quiz. But what do you got, 500 people, it's about right. We should have, any mathematicians? Right? Law of large numbers works here. No mathematicians, so nobody knows whether I used that correctly in that phrase. Okay, 500 people. How many of you have had a significant fire in your house? Something like 5. Sounds like 1%. I'll still leave it at 1%, even though that changed the number by 20. Okay, still good enough. 1% is a pretty standard number. How many of you have fire insurance? Fools! 5% risk. We're not going to spend public blood and treasury to sit there and deal with a 5% risk that the ice sheets melt, sea levels rise 20 feet, that 50% of species go extinct, and California burns 10 times more often than now. I'm what, 5%? Way too low. When we could be 500%